good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this discussion about the political outlook and the mood in the United States after the caucus in Iowa and the primary in New Hampshire, and in the run-up to important contests and, of course, Super Tuesday on March 5th, when over a dozen states, including California and Texas, will hold their primaries. Today's event kicks off a new initiative titled Road to Election 2024, and the American Council on Germany is absolutely delighted to partner with more than 24 other German-American organizations on both sides of the Atlantic to host events from January 2024 through the inauguration in January 2025. As I think all of our viewers and listeners know, there is a huge appetite in Germany and across Europe and in the transatlantic community writ large for information, insights, and dialogue about the election in the United States and their domestic and foreign policy implications. The Road to Election series aims to meet this interest by hosting events featuring prominent researchers, policymakers, commentators, and representatives from civil society on a host of topics related to the US elections. More information can be found about the upcoming events on the website www.roadtoelection.de, which will be continually updated over the course of the year. So to kick off the series, I am absolutely delighted to have two political strategists to give us their assessment of where we are and what we can expect in the year ahead. We're joined by Matt Gorman, who serves as Vice President of Target Victory, a Washington, D.C.-based public affairs and digital marketing firm. He's worked on 3 presidential campaigns, having most recently served as a senior advisor to Tim Scott for America. Matt, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, everyone. I'm excited to be a part of this.
And joining Matt is Margie Omero. She is a principal at the Democratic polling firm GBAO and has over 25 years of experience providing strategic advice to political candidates. Margie, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you for having me.
Today's event will be moderated by the German journalist Juliane Schäuble. She's been covering U.S. politics over the past 5 years as the U.S. correspondent for the Berlin daily Der Tagesspiegel. Juliane, herzlich willkommen. We are delighted to have you with us as well.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So let me just remind our viewers that if you have a question today, you can use the Q&A function in Zoom, and please let us know who the question is directed to so that we can make sure that your question is posed to the right person. Juliane, I actually started my day today by reading your Washington Weekly column, which comes out every Thursday morning and which I can highly recommend to all of our German-speaking viewers. I read your reflections on Iowa and New Hampshire and your outlook for what lies ahead. So I know that you are the perfect person to lead today's conversation with Margie and Matt. And so with that, let me just turn it over to you, and I am very much looking forward to what you all have to say today.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I'm really happy to be here because I have so many questions on what's going on that I'm sure Margie and Matt are going to answer all of our questions here. Let me start. Since there hasn't been any official Democratic primary yet, I address my first question to Matt. And I think it's a question everybody has it on its mind. After Iowa and New Hampshire, is there any doubt left that Donald Trump will get the nomination of his party?
Very little, to be completely honest with you. It would have to take to say it would take an historic turnaround would be maybe an understatement of the year. No other presidential candidate who is not an incumbent, and Trump is not an incumbent, obviously, has won both Iowa and New Hampshire in the modern era. It's always usually split up. If you remember when Trump ran in 2016, he lost Iowa narrowly, but lost it. And, you know, as we go into South Carolina, the chance for Nikki Haley to turn around her fortunes are very, very slim. And I think what you're seeing now is a consolidation of some of the more establishment-minded Republicans who are getting behind Trump now. His campaign is starting to use talking points and messaging, looking at Joe Biden as, we all need to defeat Joe Biden. We need to come together and do that. So in some ways, I would expect them maybe to start ignoring Nikki a little more. But yes, in short answer, this is primary is wrapping up very, very quickly and candidly. It's where, in a lot of respects, it's been steady all along. He's had a steady lead throughout this entire process. So there will likely be surprises between now and November. I think Margie and I can agree on that. At least right now, in the primary, there hasn't been any yet.
Mm-hmm. Margie, is that good news or bad news for the Democratic Party and the Biden-Harris campaign?
Well, I'll say a few things. I think the fact that the presence of Trump in our political discourse is bad news, period. Whether he's on the ballot, whether he's consolidating his primary base, whether he's eking out a primary win, whether he's going to trail somebody else, whatever is happening, if he's part of the national dialogue and in the news on a daily basis, that's bad for everybody, because of the toxicity and chaos and criminality and threat to democracy, all the things that he brings with it, coarsening of our public life and the way we all relate to each other, all of it. So I don't root for him. He does have a very clear contrast with Joe Biden on all kinds of things, on personal character, on their record on a women's right to choose, on their commitment to investing in our workforce, everything. So it's easier to have that contrast with someone who is a former president, to look at their records, kind of an apples to apples point of view. At the same time, I feel like Joe Biden's record, and I feel like the Democratic record, stands up to any Republican candidate that has put themselves out there, given how far to the right the Republican Party has been drawn over the last few years, far outside the mainstream of where voters are on things like abortion or gay rights or book banning or these sort of basic things where you see a lot of Republicans really, speaking to a very small, narrow percentage of where Americans are.
When we look at where we are right now, the pressure seems to be mounting on Nikki Haley to fall out. Did you both expect that this goes so quickly, that we kind of are in the middle of the general election campaign already after only 2.5 primaries?
I think look, people spent a lot of time saying that Trump was going to win the primary. It was inevitable. Look at the polls. And, that when people are in that kind of scenario, it's inevitable that it doesn't quite live up to whatever that conventional wisdom is, because the conventional wisdom was so calcified around that thought. So when you emerge from New Hampshire, you can almost look at it as like a Rorschach test. And if you want to see a sign that a former president can't truly consolidate his partisan base in a state that he would need in the general election, that independents that he would need in a general election who can vote in the New Hampshire Republican primary are not with him. They voted for Haley. That the race, while he had a solid victory, it wasn't a complete blowout in the way that President Obama would have had if he was running again in a primary. So you could look at that and say this is a sign of a former president who is vulnerable with general election voters and vulnerable with Republican leaning voters who want to show up in a Republican primary. That said, I don't disagree with Matt's analysis. I mean, it looks like Trump is clearly emerged from these two contests strong, the way people predicted he'd be strong. And if Nikki Haley does poorly in South Carolina, her home state, where independents can also vote, if I'm not mistaken, in that primary. However, the demographic makeup of Republican primary voters in South Carolina is very different from the makeup in New Hampshire. And so does that mean that, if she has a higher bar for what people might expect for her in South Carolina, and if she doesn't reach that, then it might be harder for her to continue in a way that maybe she didn't have as high of a bar going into New Hampshire?
Yeah.
And, yeah.
So I guess a couple things. I work for Tim Scott, who ran against Donald Trump and the rest of the Republican field for much of last year and recently endorsed him. I don't work for him anymore, but I will say this: I think one defining time in the primary election was last fall when you started seeing New York Times, CBS, NBC, Wall Street Journal, consistent polls coming out for the first time showing that Trump was beating or pretty much even with Biden head to head. What was consistent was you had DeSantis and Nikki consistently polling ahead of Joe Biden. Tim, he was around that, but a lot of people didn't know who he was. So he wasn't really, polling ahead of him too much. But the consistent refrain we heard in Iowa, especially, but New Hampshire too, I'll loop and I'll say the shorthand was, I love Trump, voted for him twice. I just don't think he can win from primary voters. When you started to see Trump win head-to-head matchups against Joe Biden, it allowed folks' head to not be separated from their heart, so to speak. So it gave them license to, well, he can win. So let me just go with what my heart. And I think if Trump was losing 5 to 10 points consistently, this is a different primary. There's that head and heart argument is a bit bifurcated. Now, I think broadly, right, each other's best friends here. Joe Biden's best friend is Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's best friend is Joe Biden, metaphorically. And I say that because in many respects, the only Republican, according to the polling we're seeing, that could really lose to Joe Biden is Donald Trump. And really, the only Republican Joe Biden could defeat would be Donald Trump. I say that quickly. You're seeing Nikki Haley. There was one poll that had her up 18 points. And I don't think that would be actually that true, but you're looking at a much different margins with Trump versus Biden. And so I think what you're seeing here is, these folks are going to be inextricably linked. And so what I would be looking at is the folks who candidly hate both candidates. They think Joe Biden is too old. They don't think he has it. They don't like him, but they also don't like Trump. Where do they go? Do they vote? Do they come out and vote? And if so, who are they voting for? That is kind of what you're going to be hearing a lot about over the next, 8 months or so, 8-9 months. And that's what I would be kind of looking at.
Mm-hmm. What you mentioned the polls changed in the fall last year. What was the reason for this change? Was it the indictments? Is it the legal prosecution of Trump, as some people suggest?
I don't think it was the indictment as much. I do think one particular point about the indictments, a couple of things, right? I think the fact that Alvin Bragg and the case that was brought in New York involving the porn star Stormy Daniels, the payments to her, ones that one had kind of, I think both parties kind of shrugged their shoulders at, they're not really sure that this is a real case. And it hadn't been brought before, and it looked far more partisan and more of a way for Bragg to make a name for himself than some of the other cases. And I think at that time, that going first, as opposed to some of the other ones, whether it's in Georgia, the January 6th Jack Smith one, it allowed Trump and others to kind of lump them all together. And the Bragg one was the first one, so he could be like, oh, and we got another one, and we got another one. So it allowed him to loop them in. And also this too, I think most Republicans, I know Tim certainly didn't think the Stormy Daniels indictment per se was all of that kind of put together. It wasn't on the same level as the others, but it forced you, if you believed him, you're defending one of your opponents. Rightly, but you're doing it. However, when you're forced to do that, campaigns are about contrasts. So all this attention is going to your opponent, and you're having to defend him because you believe it's right. But it wastes more time for you to draw contrasts. And the biggest contrast, to kind of bring it back, was that electability argument, was that who can win this general election. So you have the evaporation of time to make contrasts, and then you have the argument that in large part got brought off the table in the fall with those polls. And that was two big differences in dynamics that hurt folks not named Trump running in a Republican primary as we got to voting time.
I don't think the polls are in any way affected by the sequencing of Trump's many trials. That's like, folks have to be, this is, for folks who are American audiences or foreign audiences, like, it's very hard for somebody who's not a lawyer or really, really into this to follow the many, many indictments and cases that Trump is facing. It is an overwhelming task that even people who, do this for a living can't do. And voters do not have a sense of criminal, civil, Georgia, New York, DC. It is too much for a normal person to be able to, and I say this, joking, for any kind of normal person to follow, because it's so overwhelming. So to say that the sequencing of which case and which prosecutor and what people think of that has affected anything happening in any poll is just not our experience. Now, what people are seeing is Trump now being more visible out there, sort of ranting and railing against, all the various, his views toward the rest of the candidate field. When he talks about abortion, he brags about being responsible for eliminating Roe v. Wade, refusing, spending more time in his court cases than he is debating, before primary voters. And those are the kinds of things that people see now that he's a candidate again, not like how people feel about Alvin Bragg. I just don't see that that's impacting how people view him as a viable primary candidate.
I guess that's my point, right? Because you're right. The sequence, people don't follow this like we all do. Hell, I get paid to do this. I cannot tell you the ins and outs of it. So they know the first one, right? Because that was out of nowhere. That was that indictment that it wasn't piled on. So you're not having to attach any more additional details onto something. So when I think it was March or something like that, when the president got indicted or former president got indicted, you have a basic set of facts, you learn about it. But then as there more come through, it becomes too much to follow. And so you become more defined by that first set of characteristics that and when it was new. And so I think that is a larger point here. And so that is, I think, in large part, if this was another one that went first, that set of facts that was established that people can kind of refer back to and define this experience by, that's a little different.
Speaking about polls, when we had the midterms, we had a number of polls that were not accurate, and the outcome was, for some people, surprising. For some, it was not. How do you what is your golden sentence you say when it comes to polls? What should people who don't do this for business do with all these polls all the time? Just wait until it's November?
So it's a good question, and it's one I've been asked. It seems like every week for the last, 10 years, basically, since we've been having these very important discussions about polling accuracy and polling coverage and the role of polling. Like, why do we do all these polls? And I think it's important to think through a couple things. One, how do we talk about polls? What do we use them for? When we're watching polls publicly, why are we doing that? Is it because we just want to know, what's the score? Is the game on? What's the score? I want to know, tell me how the game ends. Or are we using the poll to help inform decisions and decide which candidate, when you have organizations and donors and activists decide, where am I going to spend my time and my resources? And that's a different type of use. And then you have polling that's not released publicly. That's where people are trying to decide, what should I talk about? Should I talk about, which of my 10 things that I like to talk about should I talk about the most? And how do I prioritize them? And those are also, that's another use of polls. So there's all these different reasons that we look at polls, but the polling coverage that we spend a lot of time kind of thinking about is this, what's the score? Let me turn on the game and see what the score is, and if someone's up 2 or down 2. And that is a not very good use of polling. That provides less of a value for everybody kind of watching this, because it draws attention away from why does this matter, and what are the candidates talking about, what is the impact of these campaigns? And you're not really getting that from +1 plus -2. Now, that said, people want to know that the polls are accurate, and so this is an important debate. And every election cycle, as an industry, I'm sure Matt's been part of these conversations too. We look, think through, and there's been academic work on it, and organizational work that's across party lines, and then we have our own work with our Democratic polling friends that we get together and discuss these kinds of things too. And we've all made some changes, I think, from each election cycle to account for different changes in how people respond to telephone calls, and how those folks may be different. Or how do we look at educational attainment? How do we ask educational attainment? So different ways of, how important are things like politics is important to my personal identity, or how easy it is or hard to get someone on the phone. Like, these are all important considerations as we try to figure out how to make polling more accurate. I think what happened in the midterms, this last midterm, a couple things. One is, I think, there, at least I feel this way. There's this sort of tendency to think like the press is sort of, it feels like people want to kind of root for the polls to be wrong. Like, the polls say this, but they must be wrong this time. And then it also feels like, how could Democrats have nice things? Like, that's how I feel the coverage. That I'm sure Matt may feel the coverage a different way, but that's like, there are polls showing Democrats doing well. That those can't be right. And so, like, that's how that sometimes comes out in some of these polling and horse race articles. And the last thing I'll say is that there were some outlets, and this was not Matt, but I saw other outlets out there who were pushing out kind of cheap polls to kind of flood the zone and change the way the polling aggregators look. So if you can push out a poll that shows, one candidate is up by 10, even though every other poll shows them down by 3, you can drive up the polling average. And then all of a sudden people are like, look, that race is on the move. And there were a couple examples where people did that. That kind of thing should be easy for reporters and press and so on to avoid. I think the last thing I'll say about this, and I think this is a good development, is that there is a lot more scrutiny and attention and knowledge of polling, even if there's way too much polling coverage. I mean, when I started, back in the Stone Age, when I became a pollster, people didn't know what I did. Candidates didn't know why they needed one. There was no such thing as, polling reporter or data journalist. There wasn't like a program you could go to at college to be in data journalism. There weren't conferences. There wasn't all this stuff. None of that, literally none of that existed. Now you have multiple news outlets where they have like an embed who manages a poll and who learns about data collection. People, scrutinize their weighting scheme, polling weighting schemes and question wording and their regional breakouts. And so that kind of level of scrutiny that doesn't happen all the time, but it happens, more than it used to, is, I think, a good development, even if that comes with sort of this glut of public polling.
Matt, what do these surveys, the polls, tell you about the issues that are driving the people to the polls? Because that's something we should all know. What are the issues people want to talk about and make them decide who they're going to vote for?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a couple things. I'm a little bit more of a layman. I got C's in math, so I'm not gonna go in depth on polling. Margie will, but what I will say is two things. Number one, look for trends, right? I kind of, when I talked a little about earlier about, in the fall, we saw a trend of polls. It wasn't just an outlier. One random poll that said Trump was, tied or beating Biden. It was 1 or 2 or 3 in a row, right? So look at that. And to Margie's point, right? If it's a bunch of, say one candidate's losing by 3 and then one's up by 10, and there isn't that isn't backed up by a bunch of others, that could tell you something. Also, look for confirmation bias. But I also said not in necessarily in party, right? Obviously, it's kind of natural, unfortunately, that we'll get polls that confirm our political side, at least publicly, when we're using it for public relations. When you're spending money, you tend to be a little bit more intellectually honest with yourself because money's a finite resource. But what I would also say is confirmation bias also occurs in newsrooms, right? So many of these news organizations do their own public polling. So let's say if CBS News has a poll that is likely probably not as good or as a bad sample or as an outlier to the other polls, they're less likely to bring in and rope in New York Times or NBC in their coverage. They're likely going to keep referencing their poll, even though it might not be the best or it might not be in line with others. There is confirmation bias in these sorts of things. What I'm also, again, as a layperson, look at not just what, say, the top 5 issues are, but how animated one base of support is with another on what those issues are. So, for example, abortion or might be, say, 3rd or 4th among the top issues listed nationally, but folks on the left who go out might go really on, like, abortion might be the defining issue. On the right, it might be immigration. The economy is something that tends to draw a little broader. So what I would also recommend is look at, it might not be the top issue, but if it animates the supporters and it's the main driver for why those people are going to the polls, that tells you something about energy. And if those people will crawl over broken glass to vote, as opposed to someone who the economy's the number one issue, but they don't feel extremely strong about it. That's insightful as well.
Margie, we had this big event starting about abortion. Is that really the top issue that is gonna be again maybe decisive for the election?
Yeah, it's very important. I think that there are some folks who want to, say, oh, that's in the rear view mirror, that happened, and that we've discussed it and we're moving on. And that would be a misreading of where voters are, because one, the polling shows incredibly consistent views and support for abortion rights, no matter how we ask it. We ask, are you pro-choice or pro-life? Do you support abortion rights in a variety of different, cases? Do you feel that overturning Roe v. Wade was good or bad for the country? Do you support a national ban for abortion? Most people say no. So there are a variety of different ways that people look at favorability toward the Supreme Court, trust in the Supreme Court, has plummeted. So no matter really how you look at it, abortion has been, the support for abortion rights is widespread and consistent. It's also a salient issue when we ask people, as Matt was suggesting, like how motivated does it make you to vote? And it is, among people who support abortion rights, more motivating than it is among people who oppose abortion rights. And on top of that, we don't even have to look at the polls. We can look at what has been happening at the actual polls, at the voting polls, at the voting booth. It's not just in the midterms, although that was very decisive, but since the midterms, you had a Supreme Court race in Wisconsin that really was about, centered on abortion rights, and that was decided quite decisively. You had 2 ballot measures in Ohio, a more Republican leaning state with a Republican governor and a Republican secretary of state who was pushing this. And those ballot measures were decided in support of abortion rights. Then there were, the Kentucky governor's race, where abortion rights were part of that debate. Obviously, a Republican state, the Democrat won there too. So there have been lots of places where abortion rights have been decided and won at the ballot box since the midterms, suggesting that this is still a salient. And then the last piece of data I'll share is, what I hear in focus groups when invariably this comes up, because people are bringing it up as a topic that's on their mind, or because I bring it up because it's something I have to ask about. I still, and did throughout 2022 and still to this day, get a lot of people, crying in my focus groups, crying because they are sharing their own stories of their own abortion, their own miscarriage, their sexual assault, something that happened in their family, men talking about how they feel they have to move to a different state because their wife is high risk and they don't want to live in a state where she is going to have a planned pregnancy and can't get the health care that she needs. So they're thinking of moving. This is like people are living under bans and the threat of a national ban right now. So there is no doubt in my mind that this is going to continue to be an issue in the election, because whoever the Republican nominee is, they're not going to be supportive of abortion rights. And so they're going to be at odds with where a majority of Americans are.
Voter enthusiasm, mobilization is one of the probably the most important things when we come to the election. We have 2 kind of old candidates, as it looks like of today, that are running against each other. How do you, and that's a viewer question, given the lukewarm enthusiasm for Biden in polls, even among stalwart Democrats, will a third party candidate, such as No Labels, swing the election to Trump, who has that hardcore 30%? That's one of the questions. If the people are so not happy about the 2 candidates, will somebody from a third party can make the difference? What do you think?
Short answer is no. Look, the third parties always sound better in theory, right? The platonic ideal of a third party, when you hear it for the first time, it sounds intriguing, right? But even for a guy like Howard Schultz, right? The American businessman who started Starbucks, accomplished guy, knew what he was doing, just absolutely got embarrassed when he got in the political arena. It is a different animal there. And I think also, Margie kind of hit it a little bit in that last answer. Once you actually get into this and you start running, there are some yes or no, left or right pro or con issues that you have to take a stand on. There's no third box, right? And it becomes very linear very quickly, and you start getting carved up on either side of the ledger. And it's not just abortion; it could be a host of different things. So people get defined by that. So there really is no ability in the American system for someone to kind of float above it. Now, the original premise is a good one, right? How do these 80-year-old men, inspire, 20-somethings, 30-somethings to vote? And that's going to be the challenge for both of them. And I think that the secret lies in the other person. I mean, I was talking with someone who used to work for a very progressive member of Congress, and he was saying in his experience, so many of the far left young voters have been turned off by the Hamas Israel conflict, and they're more sympathetic to the more Palestinian side. They're more anti-Israel than they have before, the younger kind of far left. And so they really have kind of written off Biden. And I have a hard time believing that for a far left voter is going to look at the end of the day, knowing how much they hate Trump, and be like, I'm actually going to stay home. I fundamentally don't believe that. Maybe I'll be proven wrong, but I think my large and short of it is that activism and that energy is going to come from that candidate using the other candidate as a foil. It's easy to say you're not going to vote, or you're going to sit at home in January when it's late October, when it's getting close to election day and it really gets real. That's why I think people will tend to come out.
Yeah,
Margie, do you?
I think that, I agree with a lot of what Matt said. I mean, it's easy for folks to say, like, I'm going to vote for, some kind of imaginary third party person. I mean, there isn't a no labels candidate, and the other third party, the candidate, and then the infrastructure around getting a third party candidate to, have the kind of presence is just not there. And then the third party candidates that have been floated or announced are not, do not come in with a national base, let's just say. And so, I think that as people start to dial in and they see that Trump is the nominee, which is what we assume, or at any rate, the Republican primary will be decided soon, then people will dial in and say, I want to make sure my vote makes a difference, and voting for a third party candidate may have an unintended consequence that I don't want. It is up to the campaigns and people who work in this field, in this effort, and who care about democracy and civic participation. Maybe they don't work for a campaign, but they care about democracy and voter engagement and making sure people's voices are heard. It's up to all of them to, reach out and make the case of why voting is important to young people, to newer voters, and say, this is important. Do you want to make your voice heard about student loans forgiveness, for example, which is something that Biden's been working on, and that's something that people find very important. Younger people find very important. So it's up to everybody kind of communicating in this space to make sure that younger people feel heard and listened to, and communicated with, and where they get their information, and reaching them where they are. But younger people are voting. They're I think it's a mistake to just assume that, like, younger people are going to stay home, and that's not the case, and that's certainly not true in places where voting participation is encouraged rather than discouraged. I mean, you saw in the Wisconsin Supreme Court race where you had younger people go because the way things work there, and you could have same-day registration on college campuses in Dane County and Madison, which is a very blue part of Wisconsin. You had college students going and voting. They see a sign and they go and they vote, and they were excited to participate. And that's what happens when you're not doing what happens in other states, where they make it very difficult for students who move around a lot to make sure that they're able to vote. So it does make a difference, not just at the national level, but also what's happening states and state laws and regulations as well.
Listening to you both, and there's another viewer question that fits to the impression. Is there any chance of a Democrat and a Republican running together? Could someone like Liz Cheney be a viable candidate for the center? What do you think? Since you agree on so many issues, could there be a compromise candidate?
No. No, I don't. I mean, again, it sounds good in theory, but once you get to the point, right? I mean, also, I have to laugh. Like 20 years ago, Democrats wanting a Cheney to be in the national ticket. I mean, we have to. It's funny. But no. Look, because here's the thing, right?
A sign of how far the party has gone to the right, that Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney are like somehow have become centrists, you know. But at any rate,
And imagine what they would do for you guys. But like, here's the problem. Let's pretend Liz Cheney gets elected, you know, and that anti-Trump cudgel is gone. She's gonna be a Republican. So, you know, I think what we have to remember is there is a 4 years after here. There is an agenda to be had. And so, you know, if Democrats want Liz Cheney to go for 4 years and you know, have a Republican agenda, I'd be quite surprised. But I think that is part of this too, is, you know, these things sound good in the theory, the platonic ideal of a third party candidate, compromise candidate. But, you know, if you happen to win, there is an agenda that you're going to implement. And then, you know, it just gets messier from there.
right. I mean, if Liz Cheney somehow was in power, would she be able to get Republican members of Congress to, you know, who were not happy with her, regardless, even if Trump is retired and playing golf, like they're still going to still be hold it against her, and presumably she would have a difficult time. So at any rate,
Yeah.
And then she would be at odds with Democrats in every position. Yeah. So I think, you know, I don't think these ideas would work in practice. Our system is not set up this way. And, you know, I know that there are pros and cons of different kinds of systems. And obviously the two-party system has challenges that other systems don't. But it has advantages that other systems don't. And that, like, there's, you know, there is a infrastructure to, you know, for both sides, and clarity of the distinctions between the two parties. And for most people, one of them, you know, is closer. And for some people, they move from back, you know, they decide based on the atmospherics in that election. And but a third party candidate is, you know, generally speaking, not able to, you know, to appeal to who they need to appeal, get the delegates that win the electorate and have votes in the electoral college, to, you know, get the traction that they need in order to succeed. That hasn't been successful so far, and it doesn't seem likely to be successful this time around.
It's interesting when you go and talk to Trump voters, many of them say that this is not the Republican Party anymore. This is the Trump Party. And many people from outside of the party, many critics, say the same. So that is, I mean, it's not the same. The Republican Party has changed a lot under Trump, Matt. Would you not agree?
I would. I think we've become more of a working class party. I think these were in, you know, what I'll say is this. One of the starkest examples is, you know, in 2004, President George W. Bush was just reelected. One of his first things he did was go after to reform Social Security, right? Like kind of our safety net, so to speak. And he wanted to make it a little bit more like a 401k plan. You can invest in the markets, this and that. And it went nowhere. It went nowhere. But that was in large part what he ran on. And, you know, you had Paul Ryan talking about entitlement reform and how do we save Social Security. The whole point was we wanted to kind of reform entitlements and make them solvent for the next generation. You know, my boss at his last debate was asked if he would raise the retirement age. And it's one of those, again, one of those mechanisms that you could do to tweak the numbers to make it a little bit more solvent, last a little longer. And he was dead set no. And I don't need to get the reasons for that. But my larger point is, there is more of a working class strain in the party now, where you've seen it flipped, where in, you know, Mitt Romney was kind of a last vestige of Republicans winning the suburbs, more affluent. And we were losing places like Wisconsin, Michigan, you know, in more union areas. It flipped a lot on its head a little bit. With the Hillary Trump election, you have Republicans winning more working class voters, and you have, you know, Democrats winning more of the suburbs. That each presents its own challenges and advantages depending on how you do it. I think Trump sped that along quicker, but we were heading that way. I think for a multitude of reasons, but he kind of hit it into overdrive. And yeah, I think also a lot of this is so much more cultural. You know, I'm born and raised in Connecticut on the East Coast of the United States. Going to Iowa, going to New Hampshire, you know, going to areas where I didn't have a chance to visit as much. You see kind of the stark cultural divides between folks, you know, here in Washington, D.C. or in New York or in California, and how lives were connected, certainly, but they lead different lives, and there's different sets of values, different cultures. Not judging either way, but there are some divides there, and I think that explains some of that too.
I do think that it's important for Democrats to continue to make an economic argument, because it's hard. I know that Republicans like to say we're the working class party, but Republicans in the House want to cut food assistance to hungry kids and kids who don't have enough food. They voted against, capping the cost of insulin, which is a, prescription drug that many people use, and making it easier for Medicare to negotiate lower prices. So, however you look at it, there's lots of different, the Trump tax cuts went disproportionately to the wealthy. So, I mean, there are lots of examples of how the Republican Party policies still don't prioritize the working class. And so it's important that Democrats, that we as a party make sure to make that case, that it's important for us to make that case. I do think that there have been kind of cultural debates, whether it's around things like guns or book banning or what have you. And I think in a lot of those places, the tide has turned as well, where you have, clear support for things like stronger gun laws, clear opposition to the book bans that have happened, didn't launch, it wasn't successful for Ron DeSantis to launch his, national presidential campaign. And those policies have not become popular around the country. And so, I do think this is an important thing for debate for the two parties to have. It's definitely part of, what we discuss as a party, in our political discourse, and whether it's economic or whether it's cultural, either way, it's important the Democratic Party, makes a case for itself.
There's another voter question that goes to you, Matt. If it's true that Biden would lose to any other GOP candidate, why isn't the party forcing Trump to step down and find another more electable candidate? And maybe that's the question most Germans I speak to have. Why are they going to vote for Trump again? Explain it to us.
A couple of things. Just to state the facts. He's the most popular member of the Republican Party. He is. And I think that would have been the choice they would have had to face if Trump was losing general election matchups. Now, I also think, though, there is an affinity to him. I mean, he was president before. He has a lot of the base behind him, and he is winning, roughly at 40 to 50%. But that's the honest question. I think also, though, you have somebody who, the best way to put it is, I think in American politics, more than any other place, you're inviting the person home with you, right? And Trump was everywhere. He was a known commodity for a long time. And so he had an easier divide to kind of appeal to folks. Now, he tapped something within the Republican Party that I think a lot of folks for a long time felt was not spoken to. But you're right. Like, there is a kind of a head versus heart argument, but it became a lot easier for them once A, Joe Biden became the Democratic nominee, and B, once he could be seen to, at least according to the polls, to have won again, it unfortunately, for folks that ran against him, took away some of that argument, and made Trump stronger as a primary candidate. And the way we're set up, it's not a national primary. You win certain states. So I think that it's not the best answer, to be completely honest with you, but that's kind of the appeal he has in our party, and why it's been hard to bifurcate that head versus heart argument.
Mm-hmm. Another interesting question, considering the age of both candidates, this might be the first time that the VP candidate impacts the voting decisions. Questions to both of you. Kamala Harris polls are not good. They are probably worse than Biden still. Is there any chance that the party will still dump Kamala Harris? My question would also be, is she a liability or an asset? And how is the Democratic Party going to emphasize that? And to Matt, who could be the VP candidate of the Republican Party?
I mean, I'll go first. There's no chance of Kamala Harris being replaced on the ticket, and she's an asset with a lot of important components of the Democratic coalition and turnout, what we call GOTV, get out the vote, whether it's talking to younger voters, women, voters of color. Those are folks that, are essential to Democratic successes. And it's one that, you see the vice president speaking a lot, talking about issues like abortion rights, and student loans and so on, voting rights. And so I think we should expect to see that continue. As far as, how she polls and all of that, I think every vice president has had these challenges. This is sort of the notorious, thing of the role, and has been since John Adams was the very first vice president and sort of knocked it. So, I mean, this is something that has been kind of part of our history. And I think that, she gets sort of an unfair burden when people look at her and look at her polling, that I don't think other vice presidents who've had the same kinds of challenges have had it to face in terms of their coverage.
And Matt, is Nikki Haley going to be vice president candidate of Donald Trump?
I'm not sure. I think if that were to happen, I think you'd see, kind of some hostility among the base. I think, I think what Trump will look for is someone who first doesn't overshadow him, and who's someone who's kind of willing to play ball. I think in a large part, what I think you'll see from the first term till now, him and his team, his campaign is actually very well run. It's very organized. He has people who have, thought of to be more quote unquote establishment Republicans running the campaign. And so it's much more of a buttoned up operation than it was in 2016. But I think if he were to be elected, what they've kind of learned are what levers of power to push and where to kind of go, where when he took office in January 2017, it was much more chaotic. They didn't really know what they were doing for any sort of transition. I think that will not be the case now. I think for someone, I would look for, what I would expect to someone who wouldn't overshadow him, someone who's kind of willing to be his, kind of chief spokesperson on TV. We all know he really loves and relishes people defending him on cable news, attacking his enemies. I think how they do on TV and in the media and sparring with that would be actually another key component of the role. But look, I mean, it's also, sorry?
Sounds like Carrie Lake.
I think Carrie running for Senate will probably be that. If she was governor of Arizona, who knows? But I think you're going to have somebody who has to fit a specific set of criteria, very specific to Trump.
Okay, there's a technical question, which I think is interesting for our viewers too. What happens if something happens that Trump is the candidate, Biden is the candidate, but something happens legally, age-wise? What can happen until November, summer?
That I mean, the short answer is it's extremely unclear. And there, whether it's death, the resignation, there's a lot of issues, right? But I mean, it'd be very hard once there is a VP picked and on the ballot to bypass that VP, right? If they're doing essentially what they're doing, right? So I'm just purely, this is speculative. Let's say Joe Biden unfortunately passed away, right? You can't go and be like, oh, Gavin Newsom, let's pull him in over, the first female Black vice president. Let's elevate him, right? In theory, you'd have to elevate the vice president. Same would happen if something happened to Trump on our side. But you saw whims of that and whispers of that in 2016 in October around the Access Hollywood tape with Donald Trump. It happened later in the year, granted, but there wasn't talk of bringing in some random person. It would be elevating Pence. I think that would be a very opaque and murky scenario to say the least. But if once a VP is in there, it's hard not to elevate him or her.
Margie, do you agree? Is there any plan B?
These are not public opinion questions. These are sort of, legal questions and operations questions. So, it would be truly out of my lane to speculate what happens other than, but I agree with Matt in terms of like, where do you begin? You begin not by just like with a blank slate. But these are not public opinion questions. These are other kinds of
pure speculation, but
question for one of the other events in this year. Another viewer question from a German perspective, that it looks like Nikki Haley will stay in the primaries for as long as possible. this would show that the Republicans could have another candidate. Wouldn't this encourage Republican voters who don't like Trump not to vote in November or even vote for Biden? So that's probably a question for Matt, but Marjorie.
I mean, I guess my thought, and I'm interested in what Matt would say. I mean, I don't know if, like, let's say Haley comes really close and she stays in and she's close, but no cigar. Does that change the Haley voters or other Republicans' views on how they vote in November? I don't know. Maybe not. It depends on what has driven them to vote for Haley. You know, I don't know. They're certainly available. They would certainly be a target, right? And consider available if they voted for Haley, but Trump is the nominee. But I don't know if her staying in the race longer motivates other people to vote differently than they would have if she doesn't. It does, however, weaken Trump. If she stays in a long time and she notches up either some wins or lots of close calls, it does have a regular cadence of stories and coverage about Trump in trouble in a way that hurts him, hurts his operation, makes him even more erratic. All of those things in a way that I think changes the dynamic of the race, or it hurts him in the general election, but not necessarily where someone says, well, now that Haley did such and such in Florida or Texas Republican primary, I'm going to vote XYZ way.
I mean, I think it's actually really, in my mind, it's pretty simple, right? At some point, Haley has to start winning these things, right? There's the 80s wrestler Ric Flair, right? He always used to say is if you want to be the man, you got to beat the man, right? I think where she faltered initially was she really, I think, was counting on second place in Iowa. She didn't get it. She needed the momentum from that second place in Iowa to boost her in New Hampshire, where she could break through New Hampshire, which was by far her best chance, at least in the short term, looking at it, because you have independents and Democrats can vote. There's no competitive Democratic primary, so they have a place to go. Getting, beaten kind of handily. It wasn't a blowout, but it was comfortable. Even though South Carolina is her home state, she's still losing by, I think, 30 points? At some point she has to, win. And I think that's the tough part. What I think is incumbent upon her now in the next week to 10 days, she needs to really lay out a realistic path about how she can actually do this, because the math gets really hard when it comes to delegates, because the way it works is it's very arcane rules, but as you win these races, you get certain delegates, and by the more you win, the more delegates you get. So you get closer and you start getting an advantage that's really hard to overcome. So, short answer is it's all kind of moot until Nikki kind of has a path to actually win some of these primaries, which she hasn't done yet.
Mm-hmm. Will we see a TV debate between Trump and Biden? What do you think?
I think it's the best
tell them to do it?
I don't. We will not. That's just me.
That one debate they had where Trump just talked over the whole proceedings. It was so horrible to watch, and I hope I never see anything like that again.
So if Biden would ask you, should I do it? You would say, no, don't give Trump the airtime.
I don't know. It would be a tough call, because obviously, it's important. It's important. It's important to see the candidates stand up to this kind of conversation. But Trump does not respect doesn't respect the institution. He doesn't respect the institution.
It doesn't. I think it benefits. It doesn't help either candidate. It speaks to Trump's weaknesses are on display, and certainly Biden's weaknesses on display in a 90-minute debate in a lot of respects. And also remember too, there was some really kind of solid disagreements between the Commission on Presidential Debates, which is the kind of third-party entity which controls the general election debates, and the Republicans on more technical things. Regardless of Trump, what they would need to sort out is the timing. So, for instance, it's a little bit antiquated, but these debates normally happen when voting's already started. So there were some serious things that would have to work through even before you involve any of the personalities. I don't think, kind of Trumpian the way he is with Biden and kind of, how he is not very nimble anymore and agile. I don't think a 90-minute unscripted debate does either of them any favors. And I think they can use the other person as a way to get out of it.
We're going, the next big important primary probably is South Carolina. Margie, what does a win for Biden has to look like in South Carolina. So you will be satisfied. The media will say this is a big win. It's like 4 years ago. This is really
I'm not concerned. He's going to have a solid win, and whatever that final number is going to be a solid win. And I don't think there's really any chance of that not happening. So I don't, it almost feels still like there's no evidence from what we've seen so far from anything that's been happening in the Phillips campaign to suggest that there's going to be anything other than a solid win for Biden. And I think the action is very much clearly on the Republican side in terms of what people are looking at.
Matt, what are you expecting for South Carolina?
I'm even looking shorter than that, right? If polls are still showing Nikki losing by 30 points, a week from now, there's going to be a lot more pressure on her. I think she's given time to kind of see two things. C, I think initially, was she going to drop out after New Hampshire? And then B, can she tighten the polls in short order? If this is still coming to 30 points, it's also in Nikki's best interest to not get demolished in her home state, if that is set up to be the case, both for 2028, if she wants to run again, business opportunities in the meantime. You never want to be embarrassed in your home state. It takes a lot of kind of that sheen off of you, no matter the party, no matter the candidate. And so I'm not saying she will, but she needs to see what the polling is between then and now. Months, a long time. And I think also the stakes get heightened a little bit. If DeSantis was still in this race, I think it looks a little different, just solely because it ratchets up the stakes if your candidacy is the only thing stopping Trump from being the presumptive nominee. I think that is a factor in her mind too, where if DeSantis was still hanging out in South Carolina, it wouldn't be the case. So short answer, watch where things are in the next 10 days. If there's a huge lead for Trump still in that state, Nikki will have some things to think about.
That would be it from us. I think Stormy is going to come in. I was told to go 1 hour.
I find it very unfortunate that we are already at the end of this hour. This was a fantastic debate, and it answered a lot of questions for me and opened up a whole can of new worms with new questions. With this, I really, really want to thank you, Juliane, for the excellent moderation, as you always do. This was fantastic, and to both of our speakers. And to tackle this can of worms and all these questions which were raised and maybe not sufficiently answered yet because they are so hard, I want to invite everybody to join us on the road to election in the many virtual events which are going to come up until November. And then also after the elections. And you find this on our webpage, Road to Election, which we are conducting together with, as Steve said, more than 24 of partners. So more than 24 partners are on board for this. Join us on this road to election. I hope to see all of you soon again. And thank you so much for everybody and also for the excellent questions of the audience. Fantastic event.